Your mind is the most valuable system you operate. It interprets reality, it evaluates risk, it selects goals, it decides direction. Everything you build externally is first processed internally, and yet, despite its strategic importance, most people do not actively manage what enters it. Conversations leave impressions, tone influences interpretation, repeated opinions gradually feel credible, social reactions subtly adjust behavior. This is not dramatic, it is gradual. Influence rarely appears as force, it often appears as familiarity. A comment repeated enough times begins to feel reasonable. A limitation expressed confidently begins to sound practical. A skeptical reaction begins to shape hesitation. Over time, exposure becomes normalization. Normalization becomes assumption. Assumption becomes belief. Belief directs action. The process is usually unnoticed because it feels natural. Human beings are adaptive, and we continuously calibrate ourselves to our environment. That ability allows collaboration and learning. It also increases susceptibility to unconscious alignment. When you enter a new workplace, you gradually adopt its tone. When you spend time in a highly anxious environment, caution increases. When you engage regularly with negative commentary, skepticism expands. This is not weakness, it is pattern recognition at work. The question is not whether influence exists, it always does. The question is whether evaluation is active. Without deliberate evaluation, repeated exposure often replaces independent analysis. You begin to think within the boundaries most frequently reinforced around you. You may not notice the shift because it feels internally generated, but familiarity is not the same as accuracy. Protection is not isolation, it is filtration. You cannot prevent exposure to opinions, expectations, or emotional states. You can decide how deeply they enter. And if your internal standards are undefined, external standards become default. If your attention is undisciplined, it becomes reactive. If your emotional regulation is inconsistent, reactions shape conclusions. Mental protection requires structure. It requires the ability to pause before agreement, to observe before absorbing, to question before adopting. This is not about resisting people. It is about maintaining clarity. Clarity reduces impulsive decisions. Clarity reduces unnecessary doubt. Clarity increases long-term consistency. When your mind remains stable, external fluctuations lose leverage. When you regulate emotional response, tone does not distort meaning. When you define internal standards, social pressure carries less weight. Protection is not defensive posture, it is cognitive discipline. It is the practice of deciding what deserves belief and what requires further examination. You do not need to reject disagreement. You need to evaluate it. You do not need to silence opinions, you need to process them deliberately. You do not need to avoid influence. You need to understand it. Exposure is inevitable. Absorption is conditional. Your mind performs best when it operates from intention rather than reaction. The goal is not detachment from the world. The goal is calibrated engagement. When evaluation becomes consistent, influence becomes manageable. When awareness increases, automatic adoption decreases. Where your mind is your decision engine. Protect it with structure. Chapter 1. The mechanics of subtle influence. Before you can protect your mind, you must understand how influence actually operates. Influence is rarely obvious. It does not typically appear as direct instruction or overt pressure. In most modern environments, influence is subtle, gradual, and socially reinforced. It operates through repetition, emotional association, environmental exposure, and perceived consensus. Human cognition is adaptive by design. The brain continuously updates internal models based on surrounding input. This adaptability allows learning and cooperation. However, it also increases the probability that external patterns become internal assumptions when evaluation is passive. One of the primary mechanisms of influence is repetition. When an idea is repeated frequently, cognitive resistance tends to decrease. The brain interprets repeated exposure as familiarity, and familiarity often feels safe. Safe ideas require less scrutiny. Over time, scrutiny decreases further, and acceptance becomes more likely. This does not mean repeated ideas are false. It means repetition increases perceived validity, regardless of objective accuracy. Without deliberate evaluation, frequency can substitute for evidence. Another mechanism is emotional tagging. Information presented alongside strong emotion, confidence, fear, urgency, and disappointment tends to embed more deeply in memory. Emotional intensity signals importance. When someone communicates a viewpoint with conviction or visible stress, the brain assigns additional weight to the message. The content may or may not be accurate, but the emotional delivery increases its retention. For example, repeated exposure to anxious commentary about economic uncertainty may increase personal risk aversion over time, even if objective data does not support heightened concern, while emotional environments influence baseline perception. A third mechanism is social reinforcement. When multiple individuals express similar views, the brain registers consensus. Consensus reduces uncertainty. Reduced uncertainty decreases independent analysis. The mind often defaults to the interpretation that group agreement signals reliability. This is efficient in cooperative settings. It becomes limiting when consensus replaces critical thinking. Perceived consensus does not require universal agreement. Even a dominant tone within a small group can shift internal calibration. If skepticism toward ambition is normalized within a peer group, ambition may begin to feel impractical rather than strategic. Authority cues also amplify influence. Statements delivered by individuals perceived as experienced, confident, or high status often bypass deeper analysis. The mind uses heuristics to conserve energy. One common heuristic is equating authority with credibility. Again, authority can be legitimate. The risk arises when credibility is assumed automatically rather than assessed contextually. Environmental saturation is another factor. Continuous exposure to specific narratives through media, workplace culture, or recurring conversations creates cognitive availability. Ideas that are easily retrievable from memory feel more common and therefore more probable. This is known as availability bias. If negative outcomes are frequently highlighted in your informational environment, perceived risk increases. If extreme opinions dominate discourse, moderate positions may feel insufficient. None of these mechanisms are malicious by default. They are features of cognitive efficiency. The challenge arises when they operate without awareness. Influence also increases under cognitive fatigue. When mental energy is depleted, the brain prioritizes speed over precision. It relies more heavily on shortcuts, emotional cues, and social signals. During periods of stress, overwork, or distraction, independent evaluation declines. In such states, suggestions are more likely to be accepted without examination. Emotional reactions intensify, defensive responses increase, nuanced interpretation decreases. Protection therefore requires managing mental energy as part of cognitive defense. It is important to recognize that influence is not inherently negative. Learning depends on influence. Skill development depends on influence. Social cohesion depends on influence. The objective is not elimination. The objective is calibration. Protection begins when you observe these mechanisms operating in real time. Notice when agreement feels immediate and ask whether it is based on evidence or familiarity. Notice when strong emotional delivery increases persuasive impact. Notice when consensus alters your comfort level with a position. This observational stance introduces cognitive space. Space creates choice. Without space, exposure flows directly into belief formation. With space, exposure passes through evaluation. Evaluation requires 3 steps. First, separate content from delivery. Assess whether the idea itself has merit independent of tone. Second, examine repetition. Determine whether acceptance is emerging from frequency rather than strength of argument. Third, consider alignment. Evaluate whether the idea fits your defined standards, objectives, and values rather than the expectations of the immediate environment. These steps do not require confrontation, they require reflection. Over time, consistent evaluation strengthens discernment, automatic absorption decreases, emotional reactivity shortens, internal stability increases. You will still encounter strong opinions, you will still experience social pressure, you will still operate within cultural frameworks. The difference is that your mind will no longer default to passive adaptation, it will engage actively. The more consistently you practice awareness of influence mechanics, the less likely you are to mistake external repetition for internal conviction. This distinction is foundational. Independent thinking does not mean rejecting others. It means processing input through defined standards rather than inherited patterns. When you understand how subtle influence operates, you reduce its unconscious power. You recognize that feeling familiar is not the same as being accurate. You recognize that strong emotion is not the same as strong evidence. You recognize that consensus is not the same as correctness. These realizations do not isolate you from society, they stabilize you within it. Mental protection begins not with resistance, but with recognition. And recognition begins with understanding the mechanics behind the process. Now to Chapter 2, Emotional Regulation as a Cognitive Safeguard. Emotional regulation is not a soft skill, it is a cognitive safeguard. If subtle influence enters through repetition and familiarity, it embeds more deeply when paired with unmanaged emotion. The human brain prioritizes emotionally charged information. When emotional intensity rises, analytical precision often declines. Protection of the mind therefore requires disciplined emotional management, not suppression, but regulation. When an emotion serves a functional purpose, it signals relevance, it highlights perceived opportunity or threat, it directs attention toward what appears important. Without emotion, decision-making would stall. However, when emotional response becomes disproportionate to evidence, perception can narrow. Under emotional activation, the brain shifts toward rapid processing. This can be efficient in urgent situations. It becomes less effective when evaluating complex information or subtle social dynamics. In those moments, tone can distort meaning and reaction can replace assessment. Consider how criticism is processed. If feedback is delivered with intensity, defensiveness may arise before the content is fully evaluated. Once defensive, the mind prioritizes protection of self-image rather than objective analysis. The probability of extracting useful insight decreases. Similarly, when praise is delivered with enthusiasm, confidence may temporarily inflate beyond evidence. This can lead to overcommitment or reduced caution. Emotional elevation, like emotional contraction, can influence judgment. Regulation introduces balance. The first stage of regulation is recognition. Emotional shifts typically begin with physiological signals. Breathing pattern changes, muscular tension increases, heart rate accelerates, attention narrows. By noticing these signals early, you interrupt automatic escalation. This interruption creates a brief pause. The pause is strategic. It allows cognitive systems responsible for reasoning to remain engaged rather than overridden. The second stage is separation, separate stimulus from interpretation. An external event occurs, a comment is made, a tone is used. The interpretation you attach to that event is not identical to the event itself. When emotion intensifies, interpretation often becomes more absolute. For example, a brief delay in response may be interpreted as disinterest. A neutral facial expression may be interpreted as disapproval. These interpretations may or may not be accurate. Without regulation, they solidify quickly. By separating observation from interpretation, you reduce premature conclusion. This maintains flexibility in thinking. The third stage involves recalibration. Ask whether the intensity of the emotional reaction aligns proportionally with available evidence. If not, consciously adjust response. Slower speech, measured tone, or delayed reply can stabilize interaction. Regulation does not eliminate emotion, it reduces volatility. Another dimension of emotional vulnerability involves social approval. Human beings are neurologically wired for belonging. Acceptance signals safety. Rejection signals risk. As a result, anticipated evaluation can influence behavior before explicit feedback occurs. You may moderate your opinion in anticipation of disagreement, i.e., you may hesitate to propose an idea in anticipation of skepticism. These micro-adjustments often occur below conscious awareness. Emotional regulation requires noticing when anticipated reaction is influencing decision-making. Ask whether the adjustment is strategically beneficial or primarily discomfort avoidance. If alignment with your values remains intact, minor adaptation may be appropriate. If core direction is compromised, reconsider. Emotional contagion is another relevant factor. Research indicates that individuals often mirror the emotional tone of those around them. In environments where anxiety, frustration, or cynicism dominate, baseline mood may gradually shift in that direction. This process is rarely deliberate. It is automatic synchronization. Protection therefore includes monitoring environmental emotional tone. If prolonged exposure to a particular setting consistently alters your mood or confidence negatively, evaluate frequency and boundaries. This does not require withdrawal. It requires intentional calibration. Stress further complicates regulation. Chronic stress elevates baseline emotional sensitivity. When stress remains unaddressed, minor triggers can produce disproportionate responses. Cognitive bandwidth narrows and evaluation becomes less nuanced. Managing stress is therefore a structural component of mental protection. Adequate rest, structured work intervals, physical movement, and defined downtime increase regulatory capacity. When physiological systems are stable, cognitive stability improves. It is also important to distinguish between productive discomfort and destabilizing agitation. Productive discomfort accompanies growth, challenge, or constructive feedback. Destabilizing agitation accompanies perceived threat without clarity. Regulation allows you to remain present in productive discomfort without escalating into defensiveness. Over time, consistent regulation reshapes internal patterns. Emotional spikes shorten in duration. Recovery accelerates. Reactions become more proportionate. This stability reduces the probability that external emotional intensity dictates internal belief formation. In professional environments, regulated individuals are often perceived as composed and reliable. In personal settings, they are perceived as steady. These perceptions are secondary benefits. The primary benefit is internal clarity. Clarity enables better decision-making. When emotion is regulated, information is processed with greater precision. Tone is separated from substance. Immediate reaction does not override long-term intention. Regulation also supports selective openness. You can engage with differing perspectives without perceiving them as threats. You can receive critique without interpreting it as personal attack. You can evaluate enthusiasm without becoming swept into impulsivity. And this flexibility is protective. Without regulation, influence gains leverage through emotional escalation. With regulation, influence must withstand analytical scrutiny. The goal is not emotional detachment. Complete detachment reduces empathy and relational depth. The goal is proportional response. Proportion preserves perspective. Emotional discipline is cumulative. Each instance of measured response reinforces neural pathways associated with stability. Each instance of unexamined reaction reinforces impulsivity. Over time, patterns solidify. Protection, therefore, depends on repetition of regulated behavior. When you consistently observe, separate, and recalibrate, you strengthen internal authority over reaction. External events remain external. Internal response becomes deliberate. As this capacity increases, you will likely notice reduced susceptibility to tone-based persuasion, reduced volatility in conflict, and greater endurance in complex discussions. Influence loses some of its immediacy because emotional amplification no longer accelerates acceptance. In practical terms, emotional regulation transforms potential vulnerability into strategic advantage. It slows down cognitive drift. It increases clarity under pressure. It stabilizes identity across environments. You cannot control the emotional intensity of others. You can control the depth to which that intensity penetrates your decision-making. Protection of the mind requires this boundary. When emotion is disciplined, evaluation remains active. When evaluation remains active, belief formation becomes intentional. This is not rigidity, it is structure, and structure preserves independence without sacrificing engagement. Chapter 3. The discipline of selective attention. Attention is a limited resource. Wherever it is directed, Cognitive processing follows. What receives repeated attention becomes familiar. What becomes familiar begins to feel significant. Over time, significance influences belief formation. For this reason, attention functions as a gateway to mental influence. In contemporary environments, competition for attention is constant. Digital platforms, workplace demands, social conversations, and media narratives all compete for cognitive bandwidth. If attention is not deliberately managed, it becomes reactive. Reactive attention increases susceptibility to external priorities. Selective attention is the deliberate allocation of cognitive focus based on defined intention rather than immediate stimulus. Without selective attention, the mind defaults to salience. Salience refers to whatever appears urgent, emotionally charged, or socially reinforced in the moment. Urgency does not always correlate with importance. Emotion does not always correlate with accuracy. And social reinforcement does not always correlate with relevance. When salience drives attention, external noise can override internal direction. The first component of selective attention is clarity of priority. If you have not defined what matters most in your professional, intellectual, or personal development, attention disperses across stimuli indiscriminately. In that vacuum, external agendas often fill the space. For example, in a work environment, individuals without defined performance priorities may spend disproportionate time responding to minor requests while neglecting strategic objectives. The same dynamic occurs mentally. Without defined standards for what deserves cognitive engagement, conversations and content that are merely stimulating may consume disproportionate space. Clarity creates filtration. When priorities are explicit, incoming information can be evaluated for alignment. Does this input support my objectives? Does it require immediate action? Is it informational or merely provocative? This evaluation reduces impulsive engagement. Another dimension of selective attention involves information intake. The brain adapts to repeated exposure. If you consume high volumes of emotionally charged content, baseline cognitive tone may shift toward agitation or skepticism. If exposure is predominantly analytical and measured, reasoning patterns may become more structured. This does not imply avoiding disagreement or complexity. It implies intentional selection. Exposure influences baseline perception probabilistically. While a single article or conversation may not alter belief systems, cumulative patterns often do. Managing attention therefore includes evaluating the informational environments you repeatedly occupy. Interruption management is equally important. Each interruption fragments cognitive continuity. Fragmentation reduces depth of processing. Shallow processing increases reliance on cognitive shortcuts. When shortcuts dominate, nuanced evaluation declines. In highly interrupted states, individuals are more likely to adopt prevailing opinions without thorough examination because cognitive energy is depleted. Depth requires sustained focus. Sustained focus requires boundary management. This does not necessitate complete isolation from communication channels. It requires structured access. Designated periods for engagement preserve intentionality. Continuous open channels promote reactivity. Selective attention also involves monitoring internal distractions. Not all diversion originates externally. Rumination, hypothetical scenarios, and replaying conversations can occupy attention disproportionately. While reflection can be productive, unstructured rumination often amplifies emotional distortion. When attention repeatedly returns to emotionally charged narratives, perceived significance increases. This amplification can distort proportional assessment. Consciously redirecting attention to constructive tasks interrupts unnecessary cognitive escalation. The practice of monotasking strengthens attention discipline. When you commit to one cognitive objective at a time, processing depth increases. Depth increases comprehension. Comprehension increases confidence in independent evaluation. Multitasking often creates an illusion of productivity. In reality, it reduces quality of analysis and increases cognitive fatigue. Fatigue lowers resistance to influence. Another component is temporal awareness. Attention allocated in the present influences mental state in the future. Prolonged exposure to reactive discourse may shape anticipatory anxiety. Sustained engagement with constructive material may increase solution-oriented thinking. Because influence operates gradually, it is useful to evaluate attention patterns over extended periods rather than isolated days. Ask what themes dominate your mental landscape weekly or monthly. Patterns reveal direction. Selective attention is not restrictive. It does not require avoiding diverse perspectives. It requires pacing and evaluation. Exposure to differing viewpoints can strengthen reasoning when approached intentionally. Continuous immersion without reflection can blur independent stance. The distinction lies in agency. When you choose when and how to engage, attention remains self-directed. When engagement is triggered automatically by notification, novelty, or social pressure, attention becomes externally directed. Externally directed attention increases the probability that environmental narratives will shape baseline thinking. Internally directed attention strengthens continuity of thought. This continuity is protective. With continuity, you are less likely to abandon long-term objectives due to short-term noise. You are less likely to shift positions based solely on trending sentiment. You are less likely to confuse frequency with importance. It is also useful to differentiate between information and commentary. Information describes events or data, commentary interprets them. When commentary dominates attention, interpretation may precede evidence. By allocating more attention to primary sources and structured analysis rather than reactive discourse, you strengthen independent assessment. Selective attention also supports emotional regulation. When exposure to highly charged content is moderated, baseline emotional volatility decreases. Reduced volatility enhances clarity. In practical terms, attention discipline can be strengthened through defined work intervals, controlled notification settings, scheduled reflection periods, and intentional content selection. These structural adjustments reduce accidental cognitive drift. Over time, the benefits compound. Decision-making becomes less impulsive, focus improves, mental fatigue decreases. External narratives lose some of their automatic influence because they must compete with established internal direction. Protection of the mind requires more than resisting ideas. It requires managing the pathway through which ideas enter. Attention is that pathway. When attention is deliberate, influence becomes filtered rather than absorbed. When attention is reactive, influence becomes embedded before evaluation occurs. Selective attention does not isolate you from the world. It positions you to engage with it on your terms. It preserves mental bandwidth for priorities that align with your standards. It reduces unnecessary cognitive clutter. It strengthens long-term stability. In an environment saturated with stimuli, disciplined attention is a structural advantage, and structural advantage reduces the probability that external noise will determine internal direction. Chapter 4. Building internal standards that anchor the mind. If attention determines what enters the mind, standards determine what remains. Without internal standards, evaluation becomes situational. Decisions shift depending on who is present, what tone dominates, or what outcome appears most socially convenient. In the absence of defined criteria, external expectations fill the space. Internal standards function as anchors. They provide continuity across environments. They reduce volatility in belief formation. They create a reference point that exists prior to social input. Many individuals operate with implied standards rather than defined ones. They have general preferences and moral intuitions, but these are not clearly articulated. When standards are vague, they are easier to override. A confident opinion can displace them. A persuasive argument can temporarily reshape them. A strong emotional reaction can suspend them. Clarity reduces displacement. Building internal standards begins with identifying principles that guide decision-making independent of context. These principles are not slogans, they are operational criteria. They define acceptable behavior, acceptable trade-offs, acceptable risk, acceptable compromise, and acceptable influence. For example, if intellectual honesty is a standard, then agreement requires evidence rather than social alignment. If long-term development is a standard, short-term comfort does not automatically determine action. If respectful communication is a standard, tone influences response but does not dictate self-worth. When standards are explicit, evaluation becomes more consistent. Consistency is protective because it reduces impulsive recalibration. Without standards, each new interaction can reshape internal positioning. With standards, input is filtered through pre-existing criteria. This does not imply rigidity. Standards can evolve with new evidence and experience. The distinction lies in deliberate revision rather than reactive adaptation. Another important dimension of standards involves self-assessment. If performance standards are undefined, feedback becomes destabilizing. A single negative comment may feel like a global judgment. A single positive comment may create disproportionate confidence. When internal benchmarks exist, external feedback becomes comparative data rather than identity threat. For instance, if you define preparation as thorough research and structured reasoning, then critique about clarity can be evaluated specifically rather than absorbed as a personal deficiency. You measure feedback against your criteria rather than your mood. This reduces emotional volatility and strengthens independence. Standards also clarify boundaries in relationships. Without defined boundaries, tolerance levels shift depending on context. You may accept treatment that conflicts with your values simply to avoid friction. When standards are internalized, you are more likely to notice misalignment early. Notice that boundaries do not require confrontation. Often they require quiet adjustment, reduced exposure, modified expectations, clearer communication. And the presence of standards allows these adjustments to be strategic rather than reactive. Professional environments further demonstrate the stabilizing role of standards. Organizations operate effectively when expectations are clearly defined. Ambiguity produces inconsistency. The same principle applies cognitively. When you define what constitutes sufficient evidence, reasonable disagreement, or constructive risk, mental processing becomes structured. Linked structure reduces susceptibility to persuasive intensity. If someone presents an argument confidently, you evaluate the argument's logic rather than the delivery style. If a group adopts a strong position, you compare it to your criteria rather than aligning automatically. Over time, this practice strengthens identity coherence. Identity coherence refers to the degree to which beliefs and actions align across situations. High coherence reduces internal conflict. As low coherence increases vulnerability to external shifts. Internal standards support coherence by creating continuity. However, it is important to distinguish between standards and ego attachment. Standards guide behavior. Ego attachment defends position regardless of evidence. Protection of the mind requires flexibility within structure. If new information contradicts a previous belief, standards of intellectual integrity may require revision. Protection is not stubbornness. It is deliberate reasoning. One effective method for strengthening standards is periodic reflection. Evaluate major decisions and identify which criteria influenced them. Were they aligned with long-term objectives? Were they influenced primarily by social convenience? Did emotional pressure alter judgment? This analysis refines standards over time. It is also useful to differentiate between inherited standards and chosen standards. Many beliefs originate from family, culture, or early social exposure. Some may align with current objectives, others may no longer serve a developmental direction. Re-examining inherited assumptions does not imply rejection. It introduces evaluation. When standards are consciously chosen, adherence becomes intentional rather than automatic. Internal standards also reduce comparison-driven instability. When performance and success are defined primarily through external metrics, self-evaluation fluctuates with social visibility. When internal criteria define progress, comparison loses dominance. For example, if progress is defined as skill development and consistency rather than public recognition, external validation becomes supplementary rather than central. This recalibration reduces susceptibility to trends. Trends often exert pressure by implying urgency or inevitability. With standards, urgency is evaluated against alignment. Not every emerging narrative requires adoption. Another benefit of internal standards is decision efficiency. When criteria are clear, deliberation shortens because evaluation pathways are predefined. This reduces cognitive fatigue and preserves energy for complex analysis. Energy preservation strengthens protection. Fatigue increases suggestibility. Clear standards reduce unnecessary processing. Over time, living according to defined standards increases self-trust. Self-trust reduces dependence on immediate external reassurance. And when you consistently evaluate input against internal criteria, you build confidence in your reasoning process. This confidence is not arrogance, it is stability. Stable individuals are less likely to overreact to disagreement. They are more capable of listening without immediate adoption. They are more capable of adjusting without feeling destabilized. Protection of the mind is strengthened significantly when standards anchor perception. Without anchors, the mind drifts toward dominant currents. With anchors, it can navigate currents without being carried by them. Building internal standards requires intentional thought, periodic review, and disciplined application. It requires distinguishing between flexibility and inconsistency. It requires tolerating mild social friction when alignment demands it. The result is cognitive continuity. Continuity reduces reactive shifts. Reactive shifts reduce stability. Stability preserves independence. And when standards are internalized, influence must align with them to persist. Misaligned input may still be considered, but it does not automatically integrate. This selective integration is the essence of mental protection. Your mind remains open, but not unstructured. Open and structured engagement reduces distortion while preserving growth, and growth guided by standards remains self-directed. Chapter 5. Social pressure and the psychology of conformity. Social pressure is rarely announced. It does not usually present itself as a demand. More often, it appears as tone, expectation, or subtle signals of approval and disapproval. Human beings are socially adaptive. This adaptation increases cooperation and reduces conflict. It also increases the probability of conformity when independent evaluation is inactive. Conformity is not inherently negative. In many situations, aligning with established norms improves coordination and efficiency. Problems arise when conformity replaces analysis or when alignment occurs primarily to avoid discomfort rather than because of reasoned agreement. The psychological foundation of conformity rests on two primary forces: informational influence and normative influence. Informational influence occurs when individuals assume that group consensus reflects accuracy. In uncertain situations, looking to others for guidance is efficient. If several people express similar interpretations, the mind may infer that the interpretation is reliable. Normative influence operates differently. It is driven by the desire to maintain social acceptance and avoid rejection. Agreement becomes a means of preserving harmony rather than reaching truth. In most environments, these forces operate simultaneously. When a dominant opinion emerges within a group, dissent may feel risky. The risk may not involve explicit consequences. It may involve subtle relational cost, reduced warmth, mild distancing, altered tone. Even small signals of disapproval can influence internal comfort levels. Over time, repeated exposure to such signals may condition hesitation before expressing independent views. Protection of the mind requires distinguishing between cooperative alignment and automatic conformity. Cooperative alignment occurs when agreement is based on evaluation and shared objective. Automatic conformity occurs when agreement is driven primarily by discomfort avoidance. The distinction is often internal. Ask whether agreement persists when imagined outside the current social context. If the opinion feels less certain when detached from the group setting, social pressure may be influencing perception. Conformity also increases under ambiguity, when information is incomplete or complex. So reliance on group cues becomes more likely. In such cases, independent research or delayed response can reduce premature alignment. Time is protective. Immediate responses often amplify conformity. When you allow yourself time to evaluate evidence independently, social intensity diminishes. Another dimension involves language patterns. Repeated phrases within a group can frame issues in specific ways. Framing influences perception by highlighting certain aspects while minimizing others. If particular interpretations dominate discussion consistently, alternative interpretations may gradually feel less plausible. This effect does not require explicit censorship. It emerges from frequency. Protection requires noticing recurring frames and asking whether alternative explanations exist. This does not mean rejecting group interpretation automatically. It means ensuring that consensus does not eliminate analysis. Status hierarchy further complicates conformity. But when high-status individuals express strong opinions, disagreement may feel disproportionate. Authority can amplify normative pressure even in the absence of explicit demands. Maintaining mental independence in hierarchical environments requires internal reference points. When your standards and reasoning processes are defined, you can evaluate authority input based on merit rather than position alone. It is useful to differentiate respect from deference. Respect involves considering input seriously. Deference involves suspending evaluation because of status. Protection requires the former without defaulting to the latter. Emotional tone within a group also influences conformity. Highly charged discussions can narrow acceptable opinion range. In emotionally intense settings, dissent may feel like escalation rather than contribution. This perception increases silent agreement. Regulation supports independence here. And when you maintain calm while others escalate, you are less likely to absorb urgency as necessity. Another important factor is repeated exposure to homogeneous networks. When social circles share similar backgrounds, values, or informational sources, perspective diversity decreases. Reduced diversity increases the probability that group beliefs will feel self-evident. Intentional exposure to varied, credible viewpoints strengthens analytical resilience. It prevents overconfidence in local consensus. It introduces friction that sharpens reasoning rather than diluting it. However, diversity should be approached strategically. Exposure without evaluation can create confusion. Exposure with defined standards strengthens discernment. Conformity also manifests through micro-adjustments. You may soften language, modify emphasis, or avoid certain topics depending on audience. These adjustments can be strategic communication choices. They become problematic when they alter core belief without conscious decision. Monitoring these micro-adjustments increases awareness. Ask whether changes in expression are tactical or indicative of shifting conviction. If conviction shifts, examine whether the shift results from new evidence or social comfort. Protection does not require constant opposition. It requires maintaining internal clarity even when external consensus is strong. One practical strategy involves articulating reasoning privately before group discussion. Writing down your preliminary position reduces drift during conversation. When discussion begins, you have a reference point to compare against evolving group sentiment. Another strategy involves asking clarifying questions, rather than asserting immediate agreement. Questions extend analysis and create space for reflection. They signal engagement without automatic alignment. It is also helpful to observe internal sensations during group interaction. If agreement produces relief rather than conviction, normative pressure may be active. Relief suggests reduction of social tension rather than resolution of intellectual uncertainty. The objective is not to eliminate social influence. Complete independence from social input would hinder collaboration and learning. The objective is proportional integration. Proportional integration means adopting ideas because they withstand evaluation, not because they are dominant. Over time, practicing measured independence increases credibility. When others observe that your agreement is considered rather than automatic, trust often increases. Disagreement delivered calmly and with reasoning is less likely to be perceived as antagonistic. Protection of the mind within social environments depends on balance. Meaning you remain open to collective intelligence while retaining individual analysis. You cooperate without surrendering agency. You align when alignment is justified, not when it is convenient. Conformity becomes problematic when it is invisible. When you see it operating, you can decide its appropriate role. Social pressure does not disappear. It is a structural feature of group interaction. What changes is your relationship to it. When you understand its mechanisms and monitor your responses, you reduce its unconscious influence. Your thinking remains yours even in collective settings. And that continuity preserves independence without sacrificing connection. Chapter 6. Information, Diet, and Cognitive Hygiene. What you repeatedly consume shapes how you interpret the world. Information functions similarly to nutrition. It can strengthen cognitive capacity or degrade it gradually. The effect is rarely immediate. It accumulates over time through repetition, tone, and framing. So, an unmanaged information diet increases susceptibility to distortion. A structured information diet strengthens clarity. In modern environments, exposure volume is historically high. News updates, commentary, analysis, entertainment, and personal communication flow continuously. Without intentional limits, intake becomes excessive. Excessive intake increases noise. Noise reduces discernment. Cognitive hygiene refers to the disciplined management of informational exposure to preserve analytical precision. The first principle of cognitive hygiene is volume control. High information volume does not necessarily increase understanding. In many cases, it increases cognitive fatigue. Fatigue reduces depth of processing. When depth declines, the brain relies more heavily on emotional cues and simplified narratives. Reducing volume does not require disengagement from current events or professional developments. It requires prioritization. Identify which information sources contribute meaningfully to your objectives. Limit repetitive exposure to content that adds stimulation without insight. The second principle is source evaluation. Not all information carries equal reliability. Sources vary in methodology, transparency, and incentive structure. Some prioritize speed and engagement, and others prioritize verification and context. Without assessing source credibility, repeated exposure may create misplaced confidence. Familiar platforms can feel authoritative simply due to frequency. Protection requires periodic review of where your information originates. Evaluate whether the source presents evidence, distinguishes fact from interpretation, and acknowledges uncertainty. Balanced reporting often includes nuance and probabilistic language rather than absolute claims. The third principle is separating data from commentary. Data describes observable events or measurable outcomes. Commentary interprets those events. Interpretation can be insightful, but it is also influenced by perspective and incentive. When commentary dominates intake, perception may narrow toward a particular framing. By allocating more attention to primary data and diverse analytical perspectives, you reduce over-reliance on a single narrative. Another critical factor is emotional intensity. Highly charged information captures attention effectively. It often emphasizes conflict, urgency, or extreme scenarios. Repeated exposure to high-intensity content can gradually elevate baseline stress or skepticism. This does not imply avoidance of serious topics. It suggests moderation of delivery style. If information consistently provokes agitation without actionable insight, consider adjusting frequency. Over time, emotional calibration shifts according to exposure patterns. A steady intake of balanced, contextualized analysis supports proportionate response. A steady intake of alarm-driven content increases anticipatory tension. Cognitive hygiene also includes managing algorithmic environments. Digital platforms frequently prioritize engagement metrics. Content that generates strong reactions often receives greater visibility. This dynamic can create echo chambers or amplify extreme viewpoints. The awareness of this mechanism reduces unintentional immersion. Actively seeking varied perspectives disrupts algorithmic narrowing. Intentional search broadens informational scope beyond automated suggestion. Another aspect involves scheduled disengagement. Continuous exposure prevents cognitive consolidation. The brain requires periods of reduced input to integrate information effectively. Without breaks, accumulation outpaces processing. In structured intervals without media or conversation allow reflection. Reflection strengthens internal synthesis. Without synthesis, information remains fragmented. Fragmentation increases susceptibility to simplified narratives because complex patterns have not been integrated. Cognitive hygiene also applies to interpersonal communication. Repeated conversations centered on complaint, speculation, or unverified claims can shape perception. This does not require avoiding discussion. It requires noticing themes. If interactions consistently reinforce pessimism without evidence, baseline outlook may shift accordingly. Conversely, interactions that emphasize constructive problem-solving may strengthen agency. Monitoring conversational patterns helps identify cumulative influence. Another dimension is intellectual humility. Information ecosystems evolve. New data may challenge previous assumptions. Protection of the mind does not mean defending outdated beliefs. It means updating beliefs deliberately when evidence warrants revision. However, constant reactive updating based on trending narratives reduces stability. The distinction lies in evidence threshold. Establish criteria for what qualifies as sufficient evidence for belief revision. This preserves balance between rigidity and volatility. The concept of cognitive hygiene also includes internal dialogue. Exposure to certain narratives can influence self-talk. If content repeatedly emphasizes scarcity or competition, internal language may adopt those themes. If content emphasizes capability and incremental growth, self-perception may adjust accordingly. Observe recurring phrases in your internal dialogue. They often mirror informational environments. One practical approach is maintaining an information log periodically. For a defined interval, track primary content categories and emotional tone of intake. Patterns may become visible. Late adjustments can then be intentional rather than reactive. Over time, disciplined information management produces compounding benefits. Mental clutter decreases, focus increases, emotional baseline stabilizes, analytical confidence strengthens. Protection of the mind requires reducing unnecessary cognitive load. Excessive or low-quality information occupies bandwidth that could otherwise support strategic thinking. This does not imply minimalism for its own sake, as it implies alignment between intake and intention. Intentional intake strengthens mental resilience because it reduces accidental narrative adoption. When you choose what enters your awareness, influence becomes filtered rather than ambient. Cognitive hygiene also improves dialogue quality. When you are grounded in balanced information, discussions are less reactive. You are more capable of engaging constructively with differing viewpoints. The broader objective is sustainability. A well-managed information diet supports long-term clarity. It reduces the probability of sudden ideological swings driven by emotional contagion. It preserves mental energy for analysis that matters. In environments saturated with content, selectivity is not avoidance. It is strategy. Information will continue to circulate at high speed. Narratives will compete for dominance. Emotional framing will attempt to capture attention. Protection lies in deliberate selection, balanced exposure, and structured disengagement. When intake is disciplined, interpretation becomes steadier. When interpretation is steady, belief formation is intentional. Cognitive hygiene is not restrictive. It is protective architecture. And architecture determines durability. Chapter 7. Boundary setting without isolation. Protection of the mind requires boundaries. Without boundaries, exposure becomes immersion. With excessive boundaries, engagement becomes isolation. What if the objective is calibrated openness? Boundaries define where your responsibility ends and another person's influence begins. They clarify what you will consider, what you will tolerate, and what you will internalize. When boundaries are undefined, external expectations can extend beyond their appropriate scope. Many individuals associate boundaries with confrontation. In practice, most boundaries are internal decisions before they are external statements. They shape how deeply you allow commentary, emotion, or pressure to affect your thinking. The first form of boundary is cognitive. Cognitive boundaries distinguish between listening and absorbing. You can listen carefully without accepting conclusions immediately. You can acknowledge another person's experience without assuming it predicts your own. This distinction preserves respect without surrendering evaluation. For example, if someone expresses persistent doubt about a professional goal, you may consider whether their concerns contain useful risk assessment. You are not required to adopt their projected outcome as your own expectation. A cognitive boundary allows analysis without identification. The second form is emotional. Emotional boundaries prevent you from inheriting emotional states that do not originate within your own reasoning. Emotional contagion, as discussed earlier, increases synchronization with surrounding tone. Without boundaries, repeated exposure to agitation or cynicism may gradually shape internal climate. An emotional boundary involves recognizing that another person's frustration does not require mirrored frustration. It involves maintaining composure even when others escalate. This does not diminish empathy. It prevents emotional displacement. The third form is temporal. Time boundaries regulate availability. Constant accessibility increases the probability that other people's priorities will override your own. And structured communication windows preserve attention discipline. This reduces reactive decision-making. In professional contexts, clearly defined response expectations reduce pressure for immediate engagement. In personal contexts, intentional scheduling supports balance. Time boundaries are rarely dramatic. They are often communicated through consistent behavior rather than explicit declaration. Another dimension involves conversational boundaries. So not all discussions require full participation. When topics consistently generate unproductive conflict or speculation, limiting engagement may preserve clarity. This does not imply avoidance of complexity. It implies discernment regarding which exchanges are constructive. A useful guideline is evaluating informational return. If repeated discussions yield minimal new insight and primarily reinforce emotional cycles, adjusting participation may be beneficial. A boundary setting also requires internal permission. Some individuals hesitate to limit exposure because they equate boundaries with rejection. In reality, boundaries support sustainability. Without them, cognitive fatigue accumulates. Fatigue reduces regulation capacity and increases susceptibility to influence. By preserving mental energy, boundaries strengthen engagement quality rather than reduce it. It is important to distinguish between isolation and selective exposure. Isolation eliminates perspective diversity and can increase rigidity. Selective exposure maintains diversity while preventing overload. For example, engaging periodically with individuals who challenge your assumptions strengthens reasoning. Continuous immersion in confrontational dialogue may reduce clarity. The difference lies in dosage and context. Boundaries also apply to identity. When you internalize labels or expectations imposed by others without examination, autonomy narrows. If repeated characterization shapes self-perception, belief formation may drift from personal assessment to external narrative. Maintaining identity boundaries involves evaluating descriptions offered by others before integrating them. Some may reflect accurate observation, others may reflect projection. Acceptance should be deliberate. In hierarchical environments, boundary clarity becomes particularly important. Authority figures may unintentionally extend influence beyond professional scope into personal decision-making. Respecting expertise does not require transferring autonomy over unrelated domains. Calibrated boundaries preserve collaboration while maintaining agency. Communication plays a role in sustaining boundaries externally. Clear but measured language often reduces friction. For example, stating that you prefer time to consider a proposal before responding establishes cognitive space. Expressing appreciation for feedback while indicating independent evaluation signals openness without surrender. Consistency reinforces credibility. When boundaries are applied unevenly, confusion arises. When applied steadily, expectations adjust. Another important element is self-boundary. Self-boundaries regulate internal patterns such as rumination or excessive self-criticism. Without limits, internal dialogue can become as intrusive as external commentary. Establishing structured reflection periods and redirecting repetitive analysis prevents mental stagnation. Boundaries also evolve. As responsibilities and environments change, exposure patterns shift. Periodic reassessment ensures boundaries remain aligned with current objectives rather than past circumstances. It is useful to observe energy levels after specific interactions. If consistent depletion occurs without proportional benefit, boundary adjustment may be warranted. This evaluation is pragmatic rather than emotional. Protection of the mind does not require defensive posture, it requires structural clarity. Boundaries define the structural perimeter within which evaluation occurs. When boundaries are intact, influence must be invited to integrate rather than slipping in through ambiguity. Importantly, boundaries should remain permeable to evidence. Complete impermeability prevents learning. Protection involves selective permeability, and you choose what enters deeply and what remains observational. Over time, individuals who maintain clear boundaries often experience increased stability. Relationships become more predictable. Professional performance becomes more consistent. Decision-making becomes less reactive. This stability does not isolate, it enhances reliability. In social systems, those who respect their own boundaries tend to respect others' boundaries as well. This reciprocity supports healthier interaction. So protection of the mind therefore involves neither withdrawal nor exposure without limit. It involves calibrated engagement supported by clear internal and external boundaries. When boundaries are established thoughtfully, influence becomes proportional rather than overwhelming. Your thinking remains accessible to growth while protected from unnecessary intrusion. That balance sustains independence within connection. Aka Chapter 8. Identity, Stability, and Narrative Control. Identity is the framework through which experience is interpreted. When identity is unstable, perception drifts in response to external influence. Protection of the mind requires clarity and stability in self-conception without rigidity that blocks learning. Narratives, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we value, shape behavior and decision-making. External narratives, repeated sufficiently, have the power to shift self-perception subtly. Social feedback, media messages, and interpersonal commentary all contribute to narrative formation. When left unchecked, these inputs can gradually redefine identity in ways misaligned with original standards and long-term goals. Maintaining identity stability begins with conscious definition of principles and priorities. Identity is not a fixed label, it is an operational compass. What are your core standards? What behaviors align with your objectives? What internal measures of success exist independently of social validation? Clarity in these areas provides a reference point for evaluating external narratives. The second aspect is narrative monitoring. Observe how external commentary influences internal language. Are recurring phrases or interpretations consistently repeated by peers, media, or social networks? Are you unconsciously adopting descriptors or assumptions about yourself without deliberate assessment? Awareness is the first step in preserving autonomy. External influence is rarely overt. Praise, criticism, subtle shifts in tone, and repeated exposure to consensus all carry implicit expectations. Internalizing these without reflection increases drift in identity. By actively comparing external input against internal standards, you can assess alignment and decide what to integrate, i.e. self-narrative reinforcement is critical. Periodic reflection on personal growth, accomplishments, and adherence to standards strengthens continuity. Writing down achievements and rationale for decisions solidifies internal reference points. This practice reduces susceptibility to shifting social trends or short-term emotional pressures. Another element is compartmentalization. Distinguish between domains of life and the narratives that operate within them. A professional identity may require one narrative framework, personal relationships may invoke another. Compartmentalization does not mean inconsistency, it maintains contextual clarity. The skills, values, and priorities that guide one domain can remain intact without being diluted by external pressure from unrelated spheres. Identity stability also involves resisting over-identification with social perception. External labels or popularity metrics should not dictate self-worth or decision-making. While feedback can provide valuable data, internal evaluation based on personal standards ensures that adoption of external narratives remains deliberate rather than automatic. Cognitive resilience supports narrative control. When faced with repeated conflicting messages, resilient individuals can maintain coherent self-conception while considering new evidence. This does not imply ignoring contradictory perspectives, but integrating them selectively based on established criteria. Proactive narrative construction complements defensive resilience. Define the story you are cultivating about capabilities, intentions, and principles. Intentional narrative formulation strengthens clarity, allowing you to anticipate how you may interpret future events and interactions. A coherent internal story serves as a filter for assessing the credibility and relevance of external narratives. Emotion intersects with narrative control. Emotional reactivity can accelerate narrative drift. Our intense, positive or negative experiences amplified by social feedback can create temporary but impactful shifts in self-perception. Applying emotional regulation techniques, as discussed in Chapter 2, stabilizes the processing of these experiences. Stable emotion supports accurate assessment of alignment between internal identity and external events. Regular comparison between internal standards and external feedback reduces unintentional assimilation. For instance, would repeated exposure to highly confident colleagues may challenge self-perception? Rather than immediately adjusting belief, compare observed behaviors against personal goals and evidence. Adopt practices that improve performance without undermining foundational identity. Boundaries reinforce narrative stability. By limiting engagement with consistently destabilizing inputs, the mind can process information without absorbing disproportionate pressure. And boundaries also prevent erosion of identity through micro-adjustments in behavior that occur unconsciously to avoid friction or gain approval. A practical method involves establishing identity checkpoints. Periodically assess whether decisions, behaviors, and beliefs align with defined principles. These checkpoints provide feedback for course correction and help prevent cumulative drift over time. They also support the integration of constructive feedback selectively. Identity stability does not imply resistance to growth. On the contrary, a stable identity serves as a platform for deliberate development. Stability allows learning without losing coherence. New skills, knowledge, and perspectives can be integrated while retaining a consistent operational framework for evaluation and action. Another consideration is the avoidance of reactive comparison. How observing the trajectories or achievements of others can inform strategy, but should not redefine self-assessment. Metrics for evaluation should remain internally anchored. Comparison becomes productive when it informs improvement rather than challenges identity. Narrative control extends to the interpretation of failure. Individuals with stable identity view setbacks as situational or procedural rather than absolute reflections of self-worth. This perspective reduces emotional disruption and prevents temporary external evaluations from reshaping self-conception. Language reinforces narrative. The terms and descriptors you apply to yourself internally shape subsequent thought and decision-making. Deliberate phrasing reflecting standards, objectives, and principles serves as an internal feedback loop that strengthens coherence. Conversely, in adopting externally imposed language without evaluation can subtly redirect perception over time. Finally, narrative stability enhances decision consistency. When self-conception is anchored, choices are less likely to be dictated by transient social or emotional pressures. Consistent decision-making reinforces internal confidence, which in turn reduces susceptibility to external influence. In summary, identity stability and narrative control are central to protecting the mind. The combination of clear principles, self-awareness, reflection, and emotional regulation creates a resilient framework. Within this framework, external input is evaluated for relevance, accuracy, and alignment rather than automatically absorbed. Boundaries, compartmentalization, and deliberate narrative construction strengthen this resilience further. This approach does not isolate the mind from external ideas. It integrates selectively, preserving autonomy. Stability provides a lens through which influence can be critically assessed. Without such stability, even high-quality information or constructive feedback can inadvertently shift self-perception in ways that undermine consistency and long-term objectives. By cultivating identity stability and controlling internal narratives, you maintain clarity, continuity, and intentionality. You allow growth without compromising coherence. You absorb useful perspectives while filtering noise. In essence, our identity stability anchors perception, enabling deliberate engagement with the world rather than passive reaction to it. Chapter 9. Anticipating influence without overreacting. Influence is a constant, often subtle force. It does not announce itself. It operates through repetition, tone, expectation, and environmental cues. Now, anticipating influence is not a matter of predicting exact behavior or controlling outcomes. It is about awareness and strategic preparation to reduce unintentional cognitive shifts. The first principle of anticipating influence is situational awareness. Environments vary in intensity and focus. Some are high pressure, socially charged, or emotionally amplified. Others are calm, analytical, or neutral. By observing the general patterns of an environment before engagement, you can gauge the likelihood that it will shape your immediate perception. Awareness is probabilistic, not deterministic. You cannot know with certainty how an interaction will affect you, but you can assess tendencies. If a team discussion is dominated by strong opinions, there is a higher chance of emotional contagion or subtle pressure toward conformity. Recognizing this tendency allows preemptive planning. Preparation begins with mental calibration. As before entering potentially influential situations, clarify objectives and standards. What is the purpose of your engagement? Which principles are non-negotiable? Which details require flexibility? This internal checklist reduces susceptibility to reactive shifts. Another element is expectation management. External input often carries implicit assumptions about your position. Anticipating these assumptions allows you to interpret communication more objectively. For example, if a colleague expresses disagreement with strong language, you can assess whether the disagreement addresses substantive issues or merely reflects stylistic preference. This distinction prevents overreaction. Observation of patterns is critical. Influence rarely operates in a single interaction. Repeated exposure, consistent messaging, or dominant narratives are more likely to create shifts in perception. Recognizing repeated patterns allows you to evaluate impact over time rather than responding impulsively to isolated events. Emotional regulation supports anticipatory response. High-intensity interactions tend to amplify effective responses, which can distort judgment. Techniques such as controlled breathing, brief cognitive pauses, and reframing reduce the likelihood that emotional arousal will dictate decision-making. When emotion is managed, our perception remains more aligned with internal standards. Another strategy involves maintaining interpretive separation. Distinguish between the content of information and the manner of delivery. Confidence, volume, or charisma may amplify perceived validity. By separating delivery from substance, you reduce the chance of being swayed by style alone. Timing is also protective. Immediate reaction often heightens vulnerability to influence. Delaying judgment allows for reflective analysis. And structured intervals between exposure and response enable assessment based on principles rather than momentary intensity. Anticipating influence also requires probabilistic thinking. Rarely is any input universally relevant or irrelevant. Assign likelihood to the utility of incoming information based on prior experience, credibility of source, and alignment with established standards. This reduces the probability of overabsorption and reinforces selective integration. Another dimension is scenario analysis. Consider possible trajectories of interaction outcomes. Evaluate the potential impact on decisions, beliefs, and emotional state. Anticipation in this sense does not involve prediction of specific behaviors, but assessment of probable effects. It supports preparedness without overconfidence. Peer networks can amplify influence. Familiarity often creates automatic trust or alignment, even without conscious evaluation. Or periodically reassessing which individual's input holds weight ensures influence remains constructive. Influence should be weighted by evidence and relevance, not solely relational comfort. Boundaries continue to play a critical role. Temporal, cognitive, and emotional boundaries ensure that influence is sampled rather than absorbed wholesale. They provide a structural framework that contains exposure and preserves agency. Boundaries allow observation without internalization. Unreflection, after interaction, consolidates lessons. Post-engagement evaluation helps identify which influences were constructive and which could be deferred or filtered. This practice strengthens future anticipatory awareness and reduces cumulative drift. Influence anticipation also includes monitoring internal reactions. Subtle shifts in thought, emotion, or preference can indicate the presence of external pressure. And noticing these shifts without immediately accepting them allows for recalibration and reinforces independent reasoning. Cumulative practice creates resilience. Repeated conscious attention to influence patterns strengthens recognition and response mechanisms. Over time, the mind becomes less reactive and more selective. Influence remains available for integration without involuntary absorption. Language reinforcement is useful. Articulating rationale, either internally or through writing, it creates explicit reference points for comparison. When influence is encountered later, these reference points serve as a check, reducing probability of unexamined integration. It is important to acknowledge that influence is not inherently negative. Constructive influence can introduce insight, correction, or improved strategy. Anticipation is not avoidance, it is measured engagement. You retain capacity to absorb value while filtering noise. Overreaction often stems from unstructured exposure, emotional volatility, or lack of standards. Anticipation mitigates these risks by combining preparation, boundary management, reflection, and selective integration. This approach reduces the likelihood of impulsive acceptance or defensive rejection. Finally, integrating anticipatory practice with attention management, internal standards, and narrative control creates a robust protective framework. Each element reinforces the others. Attention determines what enters cognition. Standards determine what remains relevant. Narrative stability maintains identity. Anticipatory awareness moderates exposure impact. Together, they form a comprehensive strategy for maintaining mental autonomy in dynamic environments. The goal is neither impermeability nor detachment. Influence continues to exist, and some integration is beneficial. The goal is calibrated response. Anticipation allows you to engage on your own terms, on maintaining continuity of thought and alignment with long-term objectives. When influence is anticipated and filtered, decision-making becomes more deliberate, perception more stable, and resilience more reliable. Protection is achieved not by absence of input, but by thoughtful engagement. The mind remains accessible to growth, yet resistant to unexamined sway. In essence, anticipating influence without overreacting converts external pressures from potential disruptors into manageable data points. The mind remains the primary arbiter, evaluating relevance, credibility, and alignment with internal standards before integration. This balance supports clarity, stability, and strategic insight in all interactions. Chapter 10: Integrating Practices for Long-Term Mental Protection. Protecting the mind is not achieved through a single tactic or moment of insight. It is the result of consistent, integrated practices applied across attention, boundaries, standards, identity, social awareness, and information management. Chapter 10 focuses on combining these strategies into a coherent framework that supports long-term mental resilience. The first step in integration is recognizing interdependence. Attention management, internal standards, narrative control, boundary setting, anticipatory awareness, and information hygiene are not isolated techniques. Indeed, they reinforce one another. Effective attention management enhances the application of internal standards. Standards support narrative stability. Boundaries make anticipatory strategies more effective. Together, they create a network of protection that grows stronger with consistent practice. Next is routine establishment. Cognitive and emotional disciplines require repetition to become reliable. Structured reflection, regular assessment of information intake, Deliberate review of personal standards and periodic evaluation of social interactions consolidate learning. These routines act as anchors, ensuring that practices are applied consistently rather than sporadically. Monitoring mental load is essential. Cognitive fatigue diminishes the ability to apply protective strategies. Overexposure to intense social or informational environments reduces discernment, amplifies emotional reactivity, and weakens internal standards. A proactive approach includes scheduling periods of reduced external input to allow consolidation. These intervals provide space to reflect, synthesize, and recalibrate without distraction or external pressure. Boundary reinforcement is a critical aspect of integration. Boundaries define operational space and prevent intrusion that could destabilize thought processes. Cognitive boundaries preserve independent evaluation. Emotional boundaries prevent absorption of external affect. Temporal boundaries allocate resources strategically. Applied consistently, boundaries create a predictable framework within which influence can be selectively considered rather than unconsciously internalized. Identity stability remains central. All strategies interact with self-conception. Internal standards, attention focus, and selective exposure function optimally when filtered through a stable identity framework. Narrative control reinforces consistency in thought and action, reducing drift caused by repeated social input or exposure to diverse perspectives. Stability is not rigidity. It allows the integration of new evidence while maintaining coherence. Information hygiene complements other strategies. A disciplined information diet ensures that inputs are intentional and aligned with objectives. Volume, source evaluation, differentiation between data and commentary, and management of emotionally charged content reduce cognitive noise. By combining information hygiene with anticipatory awareness, you can evaluate likely influence before it occurs, mitigating reactive absorption. Social and interpersonal strategies are also integrated. Awareness of conformity tendencies, peer influence, and hierarchical pressure supports intentional engagement. Clear communication, consistent boundaries, and strategic participation ensure that interactions are constructive rather than destabilizing. This reduces the probability of passive adoption of external narratives while maintaining collaboration and connection. Reflection functions as a unifying mechanism. Post-interaction evaluation consolidates learning from multiple domains. Observing how attention focus, emotional regulation, boundaries, and identity stability responded in real time provides actionable insight. Reflection strengthens anticipation, supports adjustment of standards, and refines internal narratives. It closes the loop between practice and analysis, making protective strategies more adaptive over time. A further element is probabilistic reasoning. Absolute certainty is unavailable. Influence cannot be entirely eliminated. Instead, assess likelihoods, tendencies, and patterns. Estimate the probability that particular interactions, information streams, or social pressures will alter thought processes. Probabilistic evaluation supports measured responses, after reducing both overreaction and uncritical acceptance. Integration also emphasizes energy management. Protective practices require cognitive and emotional resources. Strategic distribution of effort ensures that high-intensity engagement occurs where it is most meaningful, while low-value exposure is minimized. Conscious allocation prevents depletion and preserves capacity for sustained application of mental protection strategies. Another practical component is scenario planning. Anticipate situations that are likely to challenge attention, boundaries, identity, or standards. Preemptive strategies, such as defining clear principles for engagement, preparing reflective questions, or scheduling periods of observation, reduce the chance of reactive drift. Scenario planning extends anticipatory awareness into actionable preparation, reinforcing stability under pressure. Over time, integrated practice produces compounding benefits. Each element reinforces the others. Disciplined attention enhances standard application, stable identity supports boundary enforcement, cognitive hygiene strengthens anticipatory reasoning, reflection consolidates all components. This integrated approach creates resilience that is greater than the sum of its parts. Feedback loops are central. Periodically evaluate the effectiveness of each strategy, individually and collectively. Observe patterns of mental drift, i.e. susceptibility to external influence and stability of narrative and identity. Adjust routines, boundaries, and standards as needed. Integration is dynamic. Practices evolve with experience and context. Integration does not imply isolation. Engagement with others, new ideas, and challenging environments remains valuable. The objective is controlled exposure, selective absorption, and deliberate integration rather than passive drift. By maintaining intentionality, influence becomes a tool for refinement and growth rather than a source of destabilization. Ethical engagement remains a guiding principle. Protective strategies are not designed to dominate or manipulate others. They are tools for maintaining clarity, consistency, and agency. Approaching interactions with respect, fairness, and accountability enhances both protection and collaborative effectiveness. Finally, long-term mental protection requires patience. Structural changes in cognition, emotional regulation, and identity coherence accumulate gradually. Immediate perfection is neither expected nor possible. Persistent application of integrated strategies builds a durable framework capable of navigating complex, dynamic environments while preserving autonomy and clarity. In conclusion, integration transforms discrete protective practices into a holistic system. Attention management, internal standards, narrative stability, boundaries, anticipatory awareness, and information hygiene collectively sustain mental autonomy. Reflection, probabilistic reasoning, and scenario planning reinforce adaptability. Ethical, deliberate engagement ensures that protection coexists with growth. Over time, this integrated approach establishes a resilient, self-directed mind capable of withstanding external pressures without sacrificing clarity, coherence, or principled action. And long-term mental protection is therefore not the avoidance of external influence, but the cultivation of a structured, self-governing mind. By consciously aligning attention, boundaries, standards, identity, and engagement with strategic principles, you create conditions for stable perception, deliberate decision-making, and sustainable cognitive resilience. The mind becomes both open and guarded, receptive yet disciplined, capable of growth without losing integrity.